What about Sister Mary Xavier? She's a very interesting person, what I know of her. Sister Mary Xavier Laughlin was a nurse in Deer Lodge at St. Joseph's Hospital. And at the Battle of the Big Hole, she and another sister from Helena went by horseback to the battle to nurse the wounded soldiers, to load them into wagons and bring them back to St. Joseph's in Deer Lodge. There is a formal thank you from the commander to the hospital, thanking them for the care that the soldiers received there. Sister Mary Xavier on our community listing for 1881 is listed as the fundraiser in Butte for the hospital. So she probably, more than maybe Sister Ignatia, was the one who collected money. I presume that Sister Ignatia was the first superior, and so she probably was doing all the negotiations for the land and the building, etc. There was also, then by October, now this is April, and by May they've purchased the land, and by October they're in need of other sisters because they've been building. And this is when Sister Mary Serena and Sister Hilaria and Sister Mary Assisio come to Butte. Here's a picture. Those were the days our sisters wore a white bonnet, a sunbonnet, and long black habit. Sister Mary Serena was the older. She had been professed for 1 year as a sister. She and the others arrived in Butte at midnight on a rumbling old stagecoach from Silverboat Junction, and they had been left there by the Utah Northern Railroad. Just within a couple of weeks, Serena contracted typhoid, and so she needed round-the-clock nursing. And she actually was the first person cared for in the hospital, although she's not the first registered patient. Well, after about 3 weeks, probably about December, she recouped and she began the drug department at the hospital. She was a druggist, and she continued as a druggist here until 1896. From here, then, she went as a druggist to St. Anne's Hospital in Anaconda, and eventually was a superior in other hospitals and died in 1933. Her sister, Sister Hilaria, no wait, I'm looking wrong. This is Hilaria. Was also, she, by the way, had just pronounced her first vows in September before she left Kansas. So they're both very young women. Sister Mary Xavier was older. But Hilaria set out to St. James, and she nursed here for about 11 years, and then left and went to other hospitals that we had, and she died in 1931. Now, they had to have a lot of strength in order to, come bubbling along on the train. The trains were not the coaches we have today. And then take a stagecoach into Butte, not knowing exactly what they would find. Let me show, maybe this picture will show up better. This is a picture of Sister Balbina. They're all good Latin names. She's a very beautiful woman. She eventually was a nurse at St. James. She became the superior of the hospital in the 1880s, 1890, and was responsible for building the wing of the hospital. Again, these are photos that probably date back to the 1880s, 1890s, because my supposition is that they may have had these photos taken before they left Leavenworth, and they were all fairly young at the time. One of our sisters, who really never was missioned to St. James, but who is very responsible for what happened in our hospitals, is Sister Josephine Bruner. Now, she's one of our sisters. Toward the end of her life, she weighed about 300 pounds, and I think about the last 6 or 7 years, she got around our mother house in a wheelchair. But she was one of the most dynamic women. She was one of the founders of our community in Leavenworth in 1858. She had been a nurse. She was from Kentucky. She'd been a nurse when our sisters were in Nashville. And she had about 10 years experience in nursing. Now, how'd she learn how to nurse? She observed what the other sisters were doing, and they taught her at the bedside. And that's what Joanna Bruner did. I'm sure that Sisters Hilaria and Serena had been trained by Sister Joanna. Sister Joanna was not only a nurse, but she was responsible for founding most of our hospitals, of which eventually we had 18, and our schools of nursing, which we have at 8. There's a street in Laramie, Wyoming, right, Mary Jane? Yeah, that's named after Sister Joanna Bruner, because of the work she did in Laramie. I lost the page here. One of our sisters, Sister Faustina Jennings. Let's see if I can find all my notes to tell you this right. Sister Faustina worked at St. James about 1889, 1890. And she was very kind. And there happened to have been a Scottish gentleman in the hospital by the name of Mackenzie. And Mackenzie would have no truck with any talk of religion. And Sister was her mission was being changed, so she was going to be going over to Helena, to St. Joseph's home. And her superior gave her some scapulars and told her she could distribute those among the patients. So she was visiting patients for the last time, and she comes to Mackenzie, and he thanks her profusely for all the good she's done for him. And then he asks if she has something, a memento, that he can keep of hers. And she kind of smiles, and she says, well, I have this scapular. So finally he agrees that, yeah, he'll take the scapular. So she leaves, and it's November 15th. And she knows from her Irish upbringing that anyone who wears a scapular within 6 months, they'll join the church. So she's in Helena, working at the orphanage. And Bishop Brondell, who was a frequent visitor at the orphanage, comes by and says that somebody over at St. James Hospital had been inquiring about Sister Faustina. And it was Mackenzie. And he had attended a mission in Butte and was baptized on May 15th, and that was her birthday. There's a good story for her. Another one of our sisters, Sister Mary Gertrude Barrett, came to St. James in about 1906. And Sister Mary Gertrude had been a druggist at St. Joseph's in Denver. She didn't have to be licensed there, but when she got to Montana, the pharmaceutical board had just begun to operate and insist that druggists be licensed. So, Sister Mary Gertrude decided she would study and sit for the examination. And on October 10th, 1906, she was the first woman in Montana to pass the exam for the pharmaceutical board. And the other 18 candidates were men, and her score ranked above the median. It was hard to dig that all up. But I just thought, you know, here was a woman who had learned how to use drugs from experience and from somebody else showing her the way. Now, the last of our sisters that I'd like to say a little bit about is Mother Irene McGrath. And Mother Irene, she at first was Sister Irene McGrath when she first came to Montana. And then she was elected our Mother General. And then she came back to Butte as the superior and administrator at the hospital. The story I want to tell you about Mother Irene goes back to her first days in Montana. She was still a novice when she and 2 other sisters came to Virginia City to open up that hospital in 1876. Now, she was young and she was pretty. She had learned to nurse by watching others. And one day, the pastor, Bob Kelleher, who was very cultured, well-educated, asked her if she would teach religion to the children, because he found it difficult to keep those children listening. So finally she said yes. Well, she taught religion in the church. And so each time she was gathered with the children in the church, she noticed there was always a lady of the parish sitting someplace in the church. And so, she didn't, dwell on it too long, but years later, when she was the administrator at St. James Hospital, Mrs., I think her name is Rawlings, Mrs. Harding, was a patient at St. James. She was from Virginia City. And she told her that all the ladies thought that sister was much too pretty and young to be in that church by herself in the midst of that rough and tumble mining camp. And so Mrs. Harding got them all organized and saw to it that they rotated the guardianship of the young sister. Now,